The King of England once paid a man in land and title for exactly one skill, the ability to fart on command. Not as a joke, not as a rumor passed down over the centuries, but as an actual clause in official crown paperwork, filed right alongside war service and castle guard duty. 12th century England ran on land, loyalty, and truly enormous quantities of roasted meat, and King Henry II held one of the most powerful courts in Europe, expecting nobles, food, and entertainment every single Christmas. Somewhere in Suffolk, a performer named Roland turned one very specific bodily function into a hereditary source of income, backed by the exact same legal machinery that handed out castles and knighthoods to men who actually knew how to use a sword. This is the very real story of Roland the Farter, and how one perfectly timed Christmas performance got somebody an actual manor house. Quick favor, before we keep going, if you're into this so far, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making stuff like this. Cool, back to Roland. Roland shows up in a document called the Liber Feodorum, or Book of Fees, a 13th century English registry of who owed what to the crown in exchange for holding land. This wasn't gossip or folklore, it was tax paperwork, the medieval equivalent of a government spreadsheet nobody expected anyone to find funny centuries later. In it, Roland appears under a handful of spellings: Roland le Farter, Rolandus le Farter, Rolandus le Petus, Roland le Petur, because 12th century England hadn't quite settled on standardized spelling, let alone standardized surnames. Picture filling out your taxes and the government just phonetically guessing your last name based on your most famous party trick. That's basically what happened here, except the party trick was flatulence, and the government kept the receipts for roughly a century. He's described as living in the first half of the 12th century, and beyond that, historians genuinely don't know much. No birth record, no death record, no mention of a spouse or parents. Roland arrived in the historical record already famous for one very specific thing, and that's basically all we've got. What Roland held wasn't just a job, it was land, and the arrangement that got it to him had a name: serjeanty. Under Norman and Plantagenet feudal law, most land came with strings attached, and the most common string was knight service, meaning you owed the king's soldiers horses and armor when he needed to go fight somebody. Serjeanty was the alternative lane, land granted in exchange for a specific personal duty that had nothing to do with combat. Some serjeanties were extremely practical, supplying firewood for the royal household, carrying the king's banner, managing the kitchens. Roland's serjeanty was not practical in any sense of the word. It existed purely so that once a year, at the most important feast of the calendar, he could do his one very specific thing directly in front of the most powerful man in England. It's the medieval equivalent of getting put on payroll, not for your resume, but because you can do a genuinely excellent party trick, and someone with real authority thought that was worth a permanent line item in the budget. The actual size of Roland's holding is where things get genuinely impressive. Sources differ slightly. Some say 30 acres, others closer to 110 acres. Roughly the size of what medieval record keepers called one hide. For context, a comfortably wealthy freeholder of the period might hold about 30 acres, while a cottager, somebody scraping by on the lower end of rural life, might have 5. So even the conservative estimate puts Roland at freeholder level, and the higher estimate puts him at nearly 4 times that, all funded by one very specific talent performed for a matter of seconds, once a year. Meanwhile, actual knights were out there getting thrown off horses and stabbed for their land grants. Roland just had to hold his breath, walk into court, and let it rip on command. And here's the part that turns this from a funny footnote into an actual legal curiosity: the performance itself was extremely specific. The Book of Fees describes his duty in Latin as unum saltum et siffletum et unum bombulum, a jump, a whistle, and a fart, and later retellings clarify that these 3 things were meant to happen simultaneously, not as 3 separate acts, described using the phrase simul et semel, simultaneously and only once. This wasn't loose variety show entertainment where Roland could riff depending on the crowd. This was a contractually specific move, executed on one specific day, judged presumably by a king who knew exactly what he was paying for. Try explaining to your manager that your entire annual performance review is one perfectly timed combo move, and if you land it, you keep your house for another year. Roland apparently nailed it consistently enough that his land stayed in his family for generations. Understanding Roland means understanding his boss, and Henry II was not a low-key guy. He reigned from 1154 to 1189, controlling an empire that stretched from the Scottish border down through western France, an area historians now casually refer to as the Angevin Empire, which is a very fancy way of saying Henry owned an absurd amount of land on two sides of the English Channel. He's remembered for reforming English law, for his catastrophic falling out with Thomas Becket, and for holding what were called crown-wearing ceremonies, formal displays of royal authority where the king showed up dressed to the nines and made sure everyone remembered exactly who was in charge. Over his 34-year reign, he held these ceremonies at 24 separate locations. This was a king who understood the value of spectacle, who used Christmas court specifically as a tool to project power and loyalty, which makes Roland's role make a lot more sense. Entertainment at Henry's court wasn't a break from the politics, it basically was the politics, just with better snacks. Roland's contract sounds absurd until you realize the crown handed out plenty of equally strange arrangements. English feudal records include a serjeanty tied to performing cartwheels in front of the king, another tied to holding the monarch's head steady if he got seasick on a boat, and yet another tied to providing a ceremonial clown performance during a coronation. Feudal England, it turns out, had an entire underground economy of court entertainers who got paid in real estate for skills that would get you laughed off a modern resume. It's a little like discovering your local county courthouse has permanent legal paperwork on file for somebody whose entire job is doing an excellent seal impression at city council meetings. Roland's fart just happens to be the one that survived in the historical record clearly enough, and specifically enough, to still be making people laugh 9 centuries later. None of this happened in a quiet little side room either. It happened at the biggest party of the medieval calendar. Christmas court under Henry II, and later his son King John, was a full-blown logistical operation. Surviving household records from John's reign show orders for 1,500 hens, 5,000 eggs, 20 cattle, 100 pigs, and 100 sheep for a single Christmas feast. And that's before you get to the 200 pigs' heads, the 50 pounds of pepper, or the 15,000 herrings. These weren't quiet family dinners, they were multi-day displays of wealth and power designed to remind every noble in the hall exactly whose kingdom they were standing in. Performers were part of that display, woven directly into the political theatre of the event. Roland wasn't the comic relief before the real business started. His performance was the real business, a scheduled, formalized act of loyalty just like everybody else's tribute, except his tribute came out the other end. Roland's most famous performance, at least according to some later retellings, didn't even happen in England. In 1171, Henry II marched into Ireland and set up a winter court just outside Dublin, and by most accounts, it was the grandest feast of his entire reign. His travelling household reportedly served swan, peacock, and, most controversially, crane, a bird the local Irish nobles apparently refused to touch no matter how hard Henry insisted, which is a genuinely relatable moment of a boss forcing everyone to try the weird appetizer nobody asked for. Some accounts of that Dublin feast claim Roland was pulled out of retirement specifically for the occasion, brought back for one more legendary performance alongside other entertainment of the evening. Whether that detail is strictly accurate or the kind of flourish later writers loved adding to a good story, it tells you something important. Roland's act was memorable enough that people were still name-dropping it as the celebrity cameo of a royal feast generations later. Imagine getting brought out of retirement for one final encore, except your entire career highlight reel is 3 seconds long and ends with a very specific sound. Part of why Roland survives so clearly in the historical record comes down to language, and 12th century England was operating in at least 3 of them at once. Royal administration ran primarily in Latin, the nobility spoke Anglo-Norman French, and English was still very much the language of everyday commoners, meaning official documents constantly borrowed and blended vocabulary depending on who was writing what. Roland's surname alone appears as Le Farter, Le Pétour, and even Le Sarcerne across different records, essentially four separate government scribes trying to spell the same joke in three different languages. The formal Latin term used in the Book of Fees for his talent was bumbulum, a wonderfully onomatopoeic little word that shows up in medieval glossaries specifically to describe flatulence, meaning some monk somewhere had the very serious job of maintaining an official Latin vocabulary list that included a fart word. Centuries later, the antiquarian William Camden included Roland in his book Remains Concerning Britain, describing his talents with the delightfully polite euphemism pout-puffing, which honestly sounds like something you'd read on a fancy restaurant menu right before the dessert course. Eventually, though, the Crown decided the whole arrangement had run its course. By the later 12th century, Roland's original performance obligation had been converted into a straightforward cash rent, somewhere in the neighborhood of 26 shillings and 8 pence a year, part of a much broader medieval trend where personal service obligations gradually got swapped out for money once cash economies made bookkeeping easier for everyone involved. The antiquarian Thomas Blount, writing in his 1679 book Fragmenta Antiquitatis, later noted that Roland's particular service had come to be regarded as simply indecent, a nice, understated bit of 17th century shade thrown at a job that had been perfectly acceptable royal entertainment 500 years earlier. It's the medieval version of a company quietly updating its employee handbook because what used to be a beloved office bit is now, upon review, a genuine HR concern. None of this hurt Roland's family financially, though, because the land stayed put. After Roland's death, Hemmingstone Manor passed to his son, Hubert the Affleton, and Hubert's son Geoffrey inherited it during the reign of King Richard I, sometime before 1189. By 1205, the manor was held by a man named Alexander de Brompton, married to Agnes, Geoffrey's sister and heir. So Roland's descendants held onto that land for roughly half a century after his single annual performance first earned it, quietly climbing the social ladder into minor Suffolk gentry, all funded by an ancestor whose entire professional legacy was extremely well-timed comedic timing. Somewhere out there, a real medieval family owed their entire inheritance to great-great-grandpa's talent show routine, and none of them ever had to explain that at a dinner party quite the way we're explaining it right now. Roland also wasn't operating in some kind of cultural vacuum, because medieval Europe, it turns out, absolutely loved a fart joke, even in places you'd least expect it. Flip through the margins of an illuminated 13th or 14th century manuscript, sometimes literally a religious prayer book, and you'll regularly find tiny illustrated figures playing what art historians now affectionately call butt trumpets, characters blasting music directly from their rear end in the white space beside sacred text. The Gorleston Psalter, a lavishly illustrated English manuscript, is famous specifically for this kind of marginal doodle, which scholars now interpret as satire aimed at pompous preachers and self-important nobles, essentially medieval political cartoons drawn in the margins of the Bible. Even the French satirist Rabelais, writing roughly 400 years after Roland's death, gave his character Panurge an entrance built around exactly the same combo move, a leap, a fart, and a whistle, performed together while shouting a celebratory toast. The exact same three-part routine, recycled across 4 centuries of European comedy, which really puts into perspective how a genuinely good bit just does not go out of style. Geoffrey Chaucer eventually took this same tradition and ran with it in the Canterbury Tales, written around 1390, in ways still taught in university literature courses today, presumably with a straight face. In The Miller's Tale, a scholar named Nicholas lets out a fart described as loud as a thunderclap, directly at a rival suitor waiting for a kiss in the dark, only to get branded with a red-hot iron in immediate, appropriately theatrical revenge. In The Summoner's Tale, a greedy friar reaches toward a sick man expecting a donation and instead receives one enormous, deeply unwelcome fart directly in his open hand, prompting an elaborate mathematical debate among the other characters about how exactly you'd fairly divide a single fart among 12 friars using the spokes of a cartwheel. Chaucer, a genuinely serious and respected poet, spent actual verse working through fart distribution math, which means somewhere between Roland's Christmas Court and Chaucer's Pilgrims, England fully decided flatulence deserved a place in its literature. Not despite the seriousness of the writers involved, but very much because of it. The job Roland technically invented never fully disappeared either, it just kept resurfacing under new names. In 1892, a French performer named Joseph Pujol debuted at the Moulin Rouge in Paris under the stage name Le Pétoman, using astonishing muscular control to inhale air into his body and expel it in tunes, sound effects, and full musical routines, becoming one of the highest paid entertainers in France at the time. Closer to today, a British performer named Paul Oldfield has spent decades touring as Mr. Metten, starting his career in 1991, appearing on Britain's Got Talent in 2009, and picking up an actual Guinness World Record in 2025 for the longest career ever recorded as a professional flatulist. So, somewhere between a Suffolk manor house in the 1100s and a reality television stage in the 2000s, the exact same skill set has now been rewarded with land, a nightclub residency, and reality show judges audibly losing it on camera. Proof that if you're genuinely great at one very specific, very silly thing, history eventually finds a way to pay you for it. Alright, that's Roland's whole strange, extremely well documented story, and honestly, this might be one of the wildest ones we've covered. Drop a comment telling us which part surprised you the most, and let us know where in the world you're watching this from. We genuinely love seeing that. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It helps us keep digging up stories exactly this weird. So here's the real question for you. If a king offered you land and a house for the one oddly specific skill you happen to be really good at, what would your version of the jump, the whistle, and the fart actually be?